This lecture, we're going to continue our review of avian anatomy and physiology, looking at primarily the nervous system, but I'm going to touch on the endocrine and immune systems as well. So let's talk about bird brains. Bird brains don't get a good rep, right? So most of the time, if someone calls you a bird brain, that's a pretty good insult, right? And a lot of that is based upon a misunderstanding about avian brain capabilities, because morphologically they're just different. They're arranged differently than mammalian brains, and so we thought that they had less capability, when it turns out that's not the case. So, but like mammals, there is a pattern where birds that are bigger have bigger brains, and that makes sense. So there's an allometric relationship there, as you would expect. But we see that some groups of birds tend to have bigger brains for their given size. So, for example, if you look at things like the songbirds, parrots, owls, woodpeckers, I mean, these birds have relatively larger brains. And we're going to see that some of these birds are also some of the ones that show some of the better potential cognitive functions. So things like tool use and learning. Other birds like the Anseriforms and Galliforms, these are kind of lumped here in the blue, not very smart birds when it comes to using their brain for higher cognitive functions. Now, if we compare birds in general, however, to other reptiles, non-avian reptiles, birds definitely are more cognitively advanced. Well, how do we compare to mammals? So again, I mentioned that we used to think that mammals were superior brain-wise. Well, if you look down here, you see that there's really a good overlap between the mammalian relationship and the bird relationship. I mean, yes, there are some bigger mammals than birds, but where we see the overlap, there's a great deal of overlap. So really, birds are quite capable from a cognitive standpoint. Well, let's look at the brain structures themselves. One of the things that birds generally have is a very large cerebellum. So the cerebellum is shown here. This is the structure associated with balance and coordination. And that makes total sense if you're going to be a flying animal. When we do some labs where we catch some birds, I'll be able to kind of move them around, and you'll show, and it'll demonstrate to you just the amazing balance that birds have and their ability to kind of keep their head in one location when the rest of the body moves. Also, birds have a very large optic lobe in most cases, and this is associated with really good vision. We've already talked about how big the eye is with regard to the orbit itself, and we'll talk about eyes in this lecture. One of the interesting factors about the avian brain is that the brain, parts of it, can change in size throughout its life. It's dynamic depending on the bird's needs. So that includes individual neural connections, the brain size itself in certain regions, and cell development. So for example, the song centers, the part of the brain that is associated with learning of song in some species and the production of song and recognition of song, those tend to increase during the breeding season. Neural structures associated with navigation and orientation, these also tend to increase in size during migratory seasons and atrophy at other times of the year when it's not needed. This is really important. We talked about how reproductive structures can change in size, can atrophy during the non-breeding season, and a lot of that was to save energy. Well, that's really important for neural structures too, because neural tissue is by far the most expensive tissue to keep going from an energetics standpoint. So, do birds sleep? Yes, they do. And they also share some similarity with mammals in the fact that they do show rapid eye movement during sleep. So it's relatively short duration REM sleep that they show, but we can show that by hooking up monitors and looking at the voltage associated with the brain's activity. And you tend to get a pattern like this during rapid eye movement. But again, it's a relatively short duration. They don't do this for very long. But we do think that there is indications from looking at this neural activity that birds do dream. Now, birds also have the capability to show unihemispheric sleep. So this is also referred to as slow wave sleep patterns. What this allows the bird to do is to turn off one side of its brain, let it recuperate and rest, while keeping the other one open. And they can actually even still keep one of their eyes open. So this allows them to sleep in a way so that they could detect the potential approach of something dangerous like a predator. Now, in slow wave sleep, the side of the brain that is asleep looks like this. So here's a good contrast in a single bird. This is the left hemisphere, which is awake. Here's the right hemisphere that's asleep. And you see that there's this alternating pattern of voltage. I don't want you to memorize these patterns. That's not crucial here. I'm just showing you that there are signs that you can recognize the different sleep patterns. Well, let's talk about the part of the brain that is associated with learning and instinct, in some cases, with critical thinking and cognitive, higher cognitive patterns, like learning. That's the cerebrum. Okay, and that's, again, it's a relatively large structure in birds, but again, it is larger in some birds than others. And this size variation does vary predictably with their capabilities to figure things out, so to demonstrate intelligence or some type of higher cognitive thinking. And one simple test of that is what's called the Krazynski problem. So the Krazynski problem involves having a wall where there's a small window here, or door. They can't get through, but they can stick their head through and see that this bowl right here's got food, this bowl here doesn't. Well, these are on little tracks, and there's swinging doors right here. And so the researcher, after they see that the test subject has seen the presence of this food, they move both of the bowls through the swinging door. Well, then the bird can't see it anymore, or the mammal if it's being tested. And so they have to, what this is a test is, do they just go, food's gone, what do I do? And they just kind of wander aimlessly. That's not a sign of intelligence. But if they can sense, like, okay, it moved that way, I don't see it anymore, but perhaps if I move that direction and go around this wall, that's where it went. So that's a sign of some kind of higher order reasoning. And it turns out that birds with large cerebrums are pretty good at this. So for example, crows, parrots. In mammals, dogs are good at this. In birds like galliforms and anseriforms, like something like a chicken, a galliform, not very good at this. They're the ones who are going to just kind of wander aimlessly. Same thing with rabbits, and cats are not very good at this, to be honest. So what are some of the other things that birds can do to demonstrate their higher cognitive functions? Well, one is they do understand numeric concepts, and they can actually learn numbers faster than most mammals, even primates. There are lots of examples of birds demonstrating what is called insight learning, meaning that you learn something by observing others and you associate it, what they did, with something like a reward. So if one bird sees another bird using a tool to get access to a food item, it can apply that knowledge to getting food resources itself. There's a famous example of bottle cap opening in tits in Great Britain, opening to get access to the cream at the top of milk bottles when they're being delivered. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But really, some of the best understanding of the true cognitive abilities of birds like parrots, like this African gray parrot here, comes from the work of Irene Pepperberg, shown here, working with Alex. Alex was an African gray parrot that allowed us some insights into their capabilities due to one simple fact. Parrots can talk. And not only can they talk, but they can demonstrate that they actually understand what the words mean and can communicate with us, at least in some crude, rudimentary way. So I encourage you to look on YouTube. There are quite a few really good videos of Alex and some of Alex's capabilities. Alex knew the terms for colors. He knew the terms for numbers. He knew things like the difference between wood and metal. He knew shapes. So Irene could ask him a question, show him a variety of objects on a tray, and say, what is the color of the four-cornered wooden object? And he would look at there, and there'd be a whole bunch of things that would be wooden there would be a whole bunch of things with different shapes, and he was able to pick out the correct one that had all of the characteristics that were asked for. We used to think that humans were very unique in their ability to use tools, but it turns out that quite a few animals do use tools, and some of the better examples are birds. So this bird right here shown is a New Caledonian crow, and it really is quite amazing at using sticks and pine needles that they actually modify to use as tools. So here are some of the tools that have been modified by Caledonian crows, and what they do is they add these little barb-like structures onto these sticks and pine needles so that they're better at grabbing insects that are stuck in crevices. And sometimes they will make a variety of tools, and they will use the individual tool that's better for a very specific circumstance. So sometimes, you might find a tool that works better in small places and another one that works that's longer, that's better when you need to go deeper to get to prey. So there's really a lot of thinking involved in this tool use. One of the coolest examples of using Caledonian crows in the laboratory, though, was they put a piece of meat in a bottle, and they just gave this crow a piece of wire. And what this crow was able to do, which was really astounding, was to bend this wire into a hook and then hook the piece of meat and pull it out of the bottle. And this crow was able to do this in very short order. Galapagos woodpecker finches will use cactus spines in a similar way to get into crevices and grab prey. They don't really modify them in any way, but they do use them as tools. I mentioned the milk cap removal and learning. That was something that happened in great tits in England. So it started off in one community where one bird was doing it and the other birds would watch and see this, and it quickly spread throughout Great Britain. And so they had to actually modify how the milk deliveries, the tops of them. A few years ago, there was a paper published in a journal called the Wilson Bulletin in which house sparrows were seen at a cafe at a train station in Australia. And that's not unusual. You see house sparrows kind of cleaning up after messes in outdoor cafes or indoor cafes if they can get into the building. But what was unique about this one was it was an inside cafe, and the birds would fly in and out of this automatic door to get access to it. Well, that in itself, again, isn't that interesting, but what the house sparrow was able to do, they found, was they would fly up to the motion detector and flutter in front of it to open the door. So they weren't just waiting for people to open the door themselves. They were actually opening the door, and they knew that that was the trigger. They had associated with that behavior at opening the door. And it was so interesting that they knew that they could just fly up and hover here, and they would actually break to the opening of the door before it started opening. So they knew that there was a time delay, but they had even figured that out. Green herons, this is a species that we may see in lab this semester. Green herons have a very wide distribution. Really, they're cosmopolitan. They can be found in many places around the world. And in many independent cases, they've been known to use fishing lures. So they'll be standing in some shallow water, and they'll place a feather or a leaf or a bright piece of floating plastic on the surface that will attract fish to the area where they then stab them and eat them. And just like any good fisherman, they will change lures if one isn't working, or if they find the one that does work, they'll carry that from spot to spot as they fish. Crows in Japan are known to get walnuts that they can't open by themselves, but they'll go to busy intersections, and at a red light, when the cars are stopped, they'll run out and put the walnuts under the car tires, then they'll back up, wait for the cars to drive, crush the seeds, crush the walnuts, and then at the next stoplight they'll run out and gather the food. So using cars as a tool in that case. Egyptian vultures are known to use rocks to crack open ostrich eggs and other large eggs that they can't physically break themselves. So another example of tool use. Now I'm going to change topics here a little bit and talk about spatial memory. Now, spatial memory is associated with, again, just what it sounds like, remembering places relative to each other. This is particularly important in two cases. So this bird on the right is a Clark nutcracker. And one of the things that this bird does in some high altitude jays, for example, is they show what is called caching behavior. So they'll get food that they know that they're going to be kind of hard to find food in the winter, and they'll cache it. So they'll store it in locations, but then they have to remember where that food is when they want to eat it later, which could be weeks or months later. And these birds will cache not in just one location. They'll do what is called scatter hoarding. So they're scattering this food all over the place. Now, the benefit of that is, if someone found your cache, they could completely rob you of all your food, and then you'd be in trouble. If they just find one of your food items that you've scatter cached, it's not that big of a deal. It's a way of avoiding risk in caching behavior. Problem with that, though, is then, something like this Clark nutcracker, they can store thousands of items in a single season. Then they got to remember where all those things are. So how do they do that? Well, they actually have a part of the brain called the hippocampus complex that is much larger in birds that do this than birds that don't. And so some of the early studies that demonstrated that this really was part of the brain that was associated with spatial memory, they took birds and they surgically, in half of them, destroyed that tissue by burning it and causing these lesions to destroy that tissue. What they found was that the birds that had this part of the brain destroyed, they could still cache. The caching behavior itself didn't change, but they just couldn't remember where anything was. They never revisited these sites. Another context in which spatial memory is important is navigation in things like pigeons. Pigeons use landmarks. They can use a variety of mechanisms in navigation. We'll talk later in the semester about that. But they can use landmarks, know the relative position of landmarks as they're traveling through an area from their home nest to an area that they may have flown to or have been taken to. Other birds do this as well. Well, let's move into the sensory structures. Let's first talk about eyes and vision. As I mentioned, birds have really large eyes, very large optic cavities, and they have excellent vision. And this can be measured in a couple of ways. First, they have better acuity, so their ability to pick out fine details is much better and be able to see things at a farther distance compared to most mammals. Also, better color discrimination. So, close colors, like something that would just look blue to us, but are really two different colors of blue, it would be clear to them that they are different. And this figure indicates what colors birds can see. So they have cones associated with seeing short, medium, and long wavelengths of light, but notice they also have a fourth series of cones that can see ultraviolet. So they can actually see into an expanded color spectrum, colors that exist, but we can't see because we don't have that capability. And I just think that's fascinating to think that they can see colors that we just can't imagine. So they have these four cone types, but they also have oil droplets, and the oil droplets are probably really key for that fine discrimination of slightly different wavelengths of light and being able to see that they are different wavelengths of light, and we wouldn't be able to discriminate those differences in such a fine manner. Birds tend to have a much greater density of cones, and again, this gives them that better vision and better discrimination. Particularly, it's better for those that are in the daylight and color vision detecting birds. The exception to that, however, is nocturnal birds. Nocturnal birds don't have the greater density of cones. Instead, they have a greater density of rods, and that gives them better night vision, which is associated with being able to see under low light conditions, but not really seeing color. Now, if we look at some of the details of the eye itself, we see that there are regions called foveas. The number of these is going to vary, we're going to see, but what these are little dips in the retina where it can allow for a kind of a concentration of cones. So this increases the visual acuity by packing in more cones in a smaller area. This also tends to be associated with detection of small, fast-moving objects. Birds oftentimes also show a concentration of cones, a density of cones in kind of a horizontal strip going across the retina. This also helps with the perception of things moving on the periphery of the vision. So here we can see a fovea. In this case, it's the central fovea. But really, it really is just this indention into the retina so that you can pack in a greater number of cones in this area right here. So I mentioned that the number of fovea varies. Fast-flying birds tend to have two fovea. So they have a temporal fovea, which is used primarily for binocular vision. So temporal means it's kind of off on the side. So you think, well, why is that associated with binocular vision? That should be forward-facing. Well, it is forward-facing because most birds, their eyes are kind of on the side of their head. Now, yes, some birds do have them, especially if you're talking about carnivorous birds, predators, they tend to be rotated a little more forward, but still they're generally on the side of the head. And so the temporal fovea, by the position they're actually in, that is forward-facing. And the central fovea, in these more lateral eyes, is going to be sending out more to the side, so that's going to be more associated with peripheral focus. And most birds just have this central fovea. But those that are really going after fast-moving prey, especially when they're fast-flying birds, things like flycatchers, that's when you're going to have both the temporal and the central fovea. One structure that's very unique in birds, so it's a synapomorphy for birds, it's only seen in birds, is the pecten. The pecten looks kind of like this old-style radiator that's sticking out into the vitreous chamber. The function of this is still mysterious. There have been several things that have been proposed that it may help deliver oxygen to the eye because the eye itself is so large. There's so much fluid in here that it needs extra oxygen. That may be part of the function. The recent studies suggest it may help in the regulation of pH associated with the eye. We still really don't know for sure. One pattern that is seen, though, is that notice that this one has got a lot of folds in it, pretty intricate, a lot of surface area. There's less surface area associated with birds that are nocturnal. So how that could be related to a physiological function, we don't really know, but that pattern does exist. And I mentioned the eyes are big, right? So they're really large eyes, and that has some consequences for their ability to fit in the skull and being able to move. So they're really filling that orbit, and that limits the movement of the eye itself. The eye itself doesn't move in birds within its orbit. Instead, birds have to move their head, and we've talked about the flexibility of the neck being important to make that possible. But the eye placement, as I mentioned, does affect whether you've got primarily binocular vision or monocular vision. So the farther forward it is facing, the greater the potential of binocular vision. And this is, again, going to be important for predatory birds and insectivorous birds because they need that greater depth perception. Now, this is also possible in birds that are restricted to monocular vision by moving their head. Because see, what binocular vision allows you to do is triangulate. So you have eyes that are looking at the same structure from different angles, and that allows the brain to figure out how far away that is. But if you're just looking at something with one eye, you can do the same thing by moving your head and moving the placement of that eye to give you that depth perception. But different birds with different eye placements are going to have different potentials for things like binocular vision and monocular vision. And then areas where they just can't see without moving their head. Here's a figure from a book that is showing a little bit of that variation in something like a vulture. These are not some of the best demonstrations of that, so I've got another slide for that. Let's contrast an eastern screech owl and American woodcock. So here is a bird that is not a predator, it's more likely to be preyed upon. So it's going to be probing the soil for, well, I mean, I guess it is a predator, it's probing the soil for invertebrates, but it's not finding that food based upon vision. It's more likely to be attacked while it's foraging. However, something like an eastern screech owl, it is really relying on vision for finding its prey. So notice the placement of the eyes, forward facing, still on the side, but more forward facing compared to an American woodcock. American woodcock, it is on the side of the head. not only just on the side of the head, but it's actually kind of farther back on the head, not completely in the center. So it's a little farther back than it is facing forward. Now, this has important consequences. If you look at the eastern screech owl, by having that forward-facing eyes, it gives them a relatively large forward capability of binocular vision. And then they also have quite a bit of monocular vision on either side that is associated with each eye. But then again, remember we talked about how owls can turn their head in 270 degrees and really expand what they can see. Well, let's look at an American woodcock just with its head still. With each eye, it has a great degree of monocular vision. Really, you're not going to sneak up on a woodcock. They can see completely around their body. Now, they have very limited depth perception, but forward, they have just this narrow area where they have binocular vision. Their binocular vision is actually best looking backwards. They can actually see behind them at greater depth perception, which, why would that be important? Well, again, if you're a predator, usually the best thing to do is sneak up behind an organism. Well, a woodcock is actually adapted for that type of predatory behavior by being able to see an approaching predator from behind and being able to judge the distance of that predator better because that's where they have the most binocular vision. So you may notice that some birds will bob their head while they walk. What this apparently is allowing them to do is to keep their focus on a specific object while they're moving, right? So they're like looking and they're keeping their head in the same position as they're moving forward, and then they poke their head forward again to get another visual cue, and they're kind of moving forward slowly and keeping their head in one location. So they're like jerking their head at times so that they're really losing that distance, but as they're moving their head back, they're keeping that structure that they're looking at in focus. Now, one of the interesting ways that they demonstrated that this is what birds are doing, this isn't just some kind of weird locomotory pattern, is if you put a bird on a treadmill, which I don't know how you would actually do that. That would be fun to see. On a treadmill, the birds aren't moving, and so they don't need to move their head back and forth to keep their eye focused on something, and they don't. They just don't bob their heads when they're on the treadmill. If you look at the color of bird eyes, you see that the iris color varies, and in some cases that is associated with closely related species that have very similar plumages, but their eye color varies. And so this is important for species recognition. But in other cases, within a species, the iris color could vary between males and females. And so this is called sexual dichromatism. So for example, in common grackles as seen here, we've got males that have this bright yellow eye, and the female has just the brown eye. And obviously this could help in mating, just determining what sex is what. But also we're going to talk about mate choice. Usually females want to make sure that they're mating with the highest quality male possible, and the brightness of the eye or the quality of the male may be linked to the quality of the eye color itself. So it may be important in mate choice. In other species, iris color can vary with age. So one of the species that we're going to be seeing primarily in the spring, in April, when we're going to start seeing these and hearing them singing very frequently, is a white-eyed vireo. And so this is a adult white-eyed vireo down here on the bottom, but a juvenile in its first year doesn't have the characteristic white eye. It has this brown eye instead. So that's a way of discriminating age in this species. Birds have 3 eyelids, so they have the top and the bottom eyelid like you do, but they also have this nictitating membrane that starts off on the side and the front and can swipe backwards. Now, what is the function of this? Well, it can help keep the eye from drying out as they're flying, so it serves kind of a goggle purpose there, but it also can serve as a goggle purpose for diving birds. And just like goggles that allow you to trap some air next to the eye so that you can focus, just like your eyes can focus on land, it gives birds that are diving, maybe chasing prey like fish, again, it gives them better vision. Moving on to ears and hearing, birds don't have external ear structures, as we mentioned. Some birds have ear-like horns, but they're not really associated with any kind of hearing structure. You will notice that the contour feathers that are covering up the auricular hole in the skull are different in their shape. They tend to be thinner with less barbs, and that just allows greater movement of vibrations into the ear for hearing. But it is important to have those covering up the hole during flight because it helps to muffle the wind noise as the birds are flying. And in birds that are diving birds, the contour feathers in those cases are modified to serve as kind of flap-like valves to keep the high pressure associated with that diving from affecting the ear structures. What are the capability of hearing in birds? Well, surprisingly, compared to humans, at many wavelengths, birds can't hear as well as we can. So that's what's shown here. If you look at a range of frequencies on the x-axis and the intensity of the sound measured in decibels, before a bird or a human could actually hear something at that range, you see that passerines, which are shown here, this line right here, the finer stippled region, is higher than this line right here, which is the human line. So anything below this, humans can't hear. But this is indicating that this line is lower than this line, which indicates that birds are not as sensitive in hearing at each of these frequencies compared to humans. This solid line right here is representing other non-passerine forms, and they're comparable in many cases to the passerines, little less sensitive at the higher frequencies as most passerines. But what is this line right here? Okay, well this is the strigiform, so the owls. And it makes sense that owls actually have greater sensitivity. They are relying on sound much more than most birds and more than humans. And so they actually do have better hearing at most frequencies compared to other birds and to humans. As I mentioned in previous lectures, birds have a single middle ear bone. So here we see the tympanic membrane, and it is connected here to this single rod-like structure called the columella or stapes that then transmits the vibrations from the tympanic membrane into the inner ear. So I've talked a little bit about the importance of stereo senses, or placing, for example, we talk about eyes, binocular vision. Having your eyes separated allows you to have better depth perception. Well, it's the same thing associated with having your ears on both sides of your head. So it allows you to have depth perception, but that usually is generally associated with your head just facing forward, and you're getting some sense of how far, what is the direction of something, right? So is it more to your left or to your right? But again, owls have generally better hearing and are reliant more on hearing. And not only do they have something like this barn owl have its ears on the side of the head, but they're at different heights. So if you look at the auricular feathers, you see that on one side, they're higher than they are on the other. So this gives this owl, a barn owl, better discrimination both in the horizontal plane like we do, but then also vertically allows them to get a sense for this ear is going to be more likely to pick up something that's slightly lower, this ear slightly higher. Working together, it allows the bird to pick up in an up and down kind of where something is, how high something could be or how low something is. We're really only good at horizontal because our ears are pretty level. But I have noticed if you go out in the field sometimes this semester, particularly looking for something like a red-eyed vireo, man, sometimes those are really hard to figure out where they are in a tree. And if you turn your head sideways, you get a little bit better idea of how high they are in the tree. So behaviorally, we can accomplish some of the same things. Some birds are very good at predicting very low wavelength sound, so infrasound. Pigeons can detect wind movements bouncing off of large structures like mountains and canyons, and they use that as part of their navigation. We talked about them being able to remember landmarks, but they can actually see those landmarks, or they can actually hear them farther off by some of these infrasound detections. We'll see that some of the birds, like some of the galliforms, can produce these really low vocalizations and also sounds using wing beats that are important in courtship displays, and they're such a low frequency that we can't hear them or have a very difficult time hearing them. Kind of at the opposite end, some birds make these high clicking noises that they use in echolocation. This is seen in some of the cave swiftlets, and this bird right here, the oil bird that lives in caves. They use this to navigate in the dark, but then also when it's night, but also in the caves themselves. It's not ultrasound, so it's something that we can still hear, and they're not as good at discriminating fine structures compared to organisms like bats that do use ultrasound. But they are, using these clicking noises and having that bounce off of structures to understand where those structures are, where the wall of the cave is, or major structures in a cave. But just like in us, the ear has additional functions besides hearing, so it can allow for balance. So the semicircular canals and the movements of the fine crystals in there touching the sensory hair-like structures can allow them to determine gravity and fast movement of their bodies, particularly important in flight. But birds are also very good at detecting barometric pressure changes, and this will allow them to determine weather changes, and this is going to be particularly important for birds that are migratory, to know when to leave, to fly over things like the ocean. They don't want to fly into a headwind. Also, at what altitude to fly at. There are certain altitudes that are adaptive from a weather standpoint, wind standpoint, and safety standpoint. And so barometric pressure changes also allow them to adjust. They understand what altitude they're flying. Moving on to taste, birds don't really have much in the way of taste buds. So here's looking at a mallard, and every time I see this slide, I hear it saying Aflac. But you see that they do have taste buds, and they're located at different parts of the palate, but it's not a huge number of taste buds. And so we generally think that birds do not have great discrimination as far as taste goes. Now, some birds, like parrots, do tend to have more taste buds, and we think it may be more important in some of those species in allowing them to select different food items. Moving on to olfaction, another form of chemosensory structure, like taste. Birds have relatively small olfactory bulbs compared to mammals. Mammals, sense of smell is very important. Pretty small in birds, but there is a general pattern that the larger the olfactory bulb, the better their ability to detect smells. So things like falconiforms, procellariforms, even some ducks, some anseriforms, their relative size of their olfactory bulb compared to their brain size, that it's bigger in those birds. And so they actually have lower detection thresholds, meaning that it takes less of the chemicals for them to be able to detect compared to most passerines and pigeons and galliforms. We'll talk about how pigeons is actually, some of them still do have at least some capability of smell that may be important in navigation. So it is kind of curious that they're way up here. So let's give some examples of some of these that do have relatively large olfactory bulbs and what they use them for. Well, finding food is the primary function. So vultures going after their sensor scavengers, they can sense the ethyl mercaptan, the rotting smell of flesh. Honey guides will go after, we'll talk about this when we talk about foraging, they actually find honeybee hives, and they're interested in eating the wax associated with it, and so they have really good sense of smell, and they can smell that wax. Kiwis are foraging after invertebrate prey in the soil, and their nostrils, unlike most birds, the nostrils at the base of the bill, and the kiwi, it's at the tip of the bill, and they'll shove their bill into the soil, sniff around to try to find their prey. Petrels and albatrosses, these are pelagic birds that are flying around looking for zooplankton swarms. Zooplankton is associated with lots of invertebrates and also fish, and they give off certain scents, and the birds will use that sense to find these schools of zooplankton. So here's an example of that, looking at this albatross, that it was radio tracked, and you see that it's flying a relatively straight line, and then all of a sudden it detects, because the wind is blowing this way, it detects, I smell a zooplankton swarm up this way. And then they change their direction, heading toward the zooplankton swarm. Now, the reason they're not going in a complete straight line here is associated with their soaring behavior, which we'll talk about a little bit later. That's what they have to do to be able to soar without having to use powered flight against the wind. Kind of like sailboats, right? Sailboats can go into the wind to some degree. They can't go directly, and they have to change their direction or change what we call their tack back and forth. As I mentioned previously, pigeons can use a scent of the landscape around them in navigation. Petrels actually are really good at figuring out not only where the food is, where they want to find it, but also back to their island and their individual nest. So they can find they nest in burrows, and they know exactly which burrow is theirs by the scents associated with it. European starlings, it's interesting, they use their sense of smell primarily in picking out herbaceous nesting material. They pick specific plants that have volatiles associated with chemicals that are able to help reduce the amount of parasites that can develop in their nests. We'll talk more about this when we talk about nesting biology. And some birds do use a scent of smell in their mating behavior. So mallards are attracted to the scent that females will produce during the reproductive season. And if you wash a female and you get rid of that, you disrupt their mating behavior. This is a picture of some crested auklets. It turns out that crested auklets, when they were first collected, the naturalists that were collecting them said they smelled like tangerines or mandarin oranges. And sure enough, that is because that's an important part of their pair bond. So it's one of the things that is used between males and females to judge each other's quality and maintain that pair bond and recognize individuals. And so that's another reason in social species, it's important to know individuals by sight in many cases and by sounds that they make. We'll talk about different individual variation in vocalizations in colonial species, but also individuals smell different. And so you can tell individuals in a social setting by their smell. Birds can also sense magnetic fields. And we'll talk about this particularly in regard to navigation, and it's important in navigation. Now, how do they do this? Well, they have magnetite in their nasal cavities and the base of their bill. Magnetite is a mineral that's polar and can allow them to judge north versus south. There are also photopigments in the eye that can sense magnetic fields in birds, and so we see that these are found in greater concentrations in birds that are migratory, that can sense the magnetic poles, than birds that are non-migratory that don't have those capabilities. Quickly, just some other sensory structures that are important in some birds. So bills, the amount of pressure sensors that they have in their bill varies. In ducks and sandpipers, there is a greater density so that they can sense pressure differences while foraging. In parrots, they have tactile receptors that allow them to better adjust the food in their mouth while they're foraging. And remember, they have these kind of palate-like tongues as well that have a lot of sensory structures in them for manipulating their food. The tongues of megapodes are modified as really good sensors of temperature. We're going to see that megapodes have a bizarre nesting behavior where they bury their eggs in these rotting heaps of vegetation or in hot volcanic soils, and they need to make sure that those nests are the exact right temperature, so the males that are in charge of these nests will stick their tongue into the nest to determine the temperature. Now I just want to give a cursory review of the endocrine and immune systems, because it's going to be really important, especially when we get into talking about reproduction. So the way the endocrine system works is there are outside influences that influence the brain, which influences the production of hormones from the hypothalamus. And hormones basically are just chemicals that are being circulated in the bloodstream that target very specific tissues for an endocrine response. And there are two basic pathways. So let's go down this left side first. One of the basic pathways is during the breeding season, for example. Changes in day length, which are sensed by the brain will then trigger the hypothalamus to produce a gonadotropin hormones that will then affect the anterior pituitary gland, which will then produce things like follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, that will trigger the development of the gonad in males and females as the breeding season ramps up. And then they additionally will produce estradiol and testosterone. So it's a cascade effect of hormones coming from different tissues, targeting different tissues downstream. Now there's another main pathway that's associated more with stress. Corticotropin hormones will be released from the hypothalamus, and they influence the pituitary in the production of adrenocorticotropic hormones that will trigger the adrenal cortex to produce this stress hormone called corticosterone. And we'll talk a lot about corticosterone and how it relates to birds going through stressful times and how it can negatively impact the immune system. So this right-hand side is really basically talking about the short-term benefits of corticosterone is associated with like fight and flight responses to short-term stress. So it's adaptive in the short term, but long-term expression of these things can be damaging. Talk a little bit about more sex determination and how hormones influences that. So just like in mammals, male and female is determined by sex chromosomes, but it's different in the case of birds. They're different sex chromosomes that are not homologous to the ones in mammals. If you get 2Z, so you're a homogametic, then you become a male. Females are the heterogametic sex, so that's opposite of what we see in mammals. They get a ZW chromosome combination. It's interesting to look at how the genetics as far as sex chromosomes work with the sex hormones to produce various behaviors in males and females. It's really almost like the male behavior is the basic behavior, such that if you see a male, you see a ZZ male, he will show a mounting behavior, for example, during the breeding season. But if you give him estradiol that will block certain other hormones in the male reproductive system, it will cause him to show more female-like behaviors. He'll refuse to mount and refuse to show the typical male breeding behavior. However, if you look at a female that's a genetic female, but you give estrogen inhibitors such that she's not showing this estradiol, she shows male behaviors, just like, so just like the male does. So it's not just the chromosome composition, but it's also the circulating hormones play a role. And one of these is estrogen produce female behaviors. And if you block those, you show more male-like behaviors. Well, what are some of the other hormones that could influence some of these behavioral traits? Well, testosterone is a clear one. And when you are restricting estradiol production, you're going to have the expression of more of the background testosterone that is even produced in female. But the more testosterone you have, oftentimes you get more dominant behaviors in males and the production of more elaborate male secondary sexual characteristics, like the house sparrow bib. This black bib is a sign of dominance and also a good correlate to the circulating testosterone in that individual. Dominance is also associated with color in a lot of birds. So carotenoids, usually a lot of times the redder, the greater the quality of that individual, and they sometimes can tolerate higher testosterone levels. We'll see that this is also related potentially to the immune system. High testosterone long term is bad for the immune system, and a male that's kind of in poor shape probably can't deal with high testosterone because of the stress associated with it. And also he can't use his carotenoids to produce the bright red plumage that is usually associated with dominance. Instead, he has to use some of it in the immune system. The carotenoids are an important part of the immune system in birds. So all of these things are kind of related, as we're going to see. Testosterone also triggers singing behavior and defensive male-male competition behaviors like territorial behavior in birds during the breeding season. But that's really influenced primarily in the breeding season because long-term, as I mentioned, long-term high levels of testosterone is counter to what's good for the immune system. And so male birds have to balance what is good for them in a single breeding season versus their lifetime reproductive success. As I mentioned, responding to stressful situations is associated with the production of corticosterone and epinephrine production. So those hormones are produced as an adaptive short-term response to a threat. So the fight or flight response, as it's oftentimes called. But these hormones can go into the blood supply pretty quickly, and they should dissipate fairly quickly too, because studies have shown that long-term levels can cause severe problems, particularly for the immune system. If you're ever studying these stress hormones in birds, it really can be difficult to collect this material, because just by doing the collection yourself, you're causing stress to the birds, and that's going to cause the fight or flight response. And so here's a study that you have to conduct. You have to look at the time at which you catch a bird and its level of corticosterone. And the general pattern is, right when you first catch them, that's your best chance of getting just whatever their baseline corticosterone is. If you hold them for even just a few minutes, you can see that their corticosterone level just shoots up. And so that's something you have to really be careful about. Here's a study that indicates just how stressful some of these conditions are, and the trade-off between, say, territorial reproductive season in one role of gaining fitness versus just trying to survive to maybe live another year where things might be better. So here's just showing you how it's a response to other types of stress. When it's good weather, white-crowned sparrows are shown to have very low corticosterone levels, but in stormy, blizzard-like conditions, winter storms, their corticosterone shoots way up. And when individuals are given corticosterone supplements, what it does is it reduces their territorial behavior. So it basically kicks them into survival mode, and they stop doing things like really costly, expensive territorial displays compared to control individuals that were not giving these supplements of corticosterone. So, as I mentioned, some of these things are linked to the immune system. The immune system is similar in birds and mammals. Immune cells are produced in a variety of locations. There is this one structure is unique to birds, the bursa fabricius. It's a pouch near the cloaca. It's seen only functionally in young birds, and it's where the immune cells are produced. But the immune cells are also produced in the bone marrow and the spleens and the lymph nodes, as we see in mammals. And sometimes, as I mentioned previously, females can put immune factors into their egg yolk to help the developing chicks get a good start and make sure that they're disease-free. All right, so let's talk about the immune system and how it might relate to some of these stress hormones and breeding hormones. Testosterone levels, again, oftentimes work counter to the immune system. So testosterone levels, having high levels might be important to convince females to mate with you and to give you the important behaviors of defending your territory against rival males. But if you do that too long, you're going to trade off your current reproductive success, which may be high, with future survival. So there's always this back and forth between what does it take for me to be able to survive for the next breeding season versus maximizing my reproductive success in this season to maximize your overall lifetime fitness. So testosterone can compromise the immune system, and then increased stress can depress the immune system too. So elevated levels of corticosterone for too long can cause problems. Now, one way you can do that is through corticosterone supplements to artificially jack that up. But you can also just make things more stressful to a bird. So experiments where they add nestlings to the nest to make it harder on the parents to be able to keep up with feeding the young and taking care of the young, that shoots up their corticosterone levels, and it decreases their chances of survival into the next year. Or if they do make it into the next year, they're in much poorer condition. And having a good immune system is important to your fitness, not only for just survival, but maximizing your chances of being able to reproduce successfully. So tundra swans, if they're in poor condition, they may delay migration or not migrate at all. Sick house sparrows have lower reproductive success. The males can't convince the females to mate with them. And in some birds that live for a long time period, they actually show a pattern of senescence. We'll talk about life history strategies and tactics later in the semester, but senescence is a pattern of decreasing likelihood of survival and decreasing capabilities of reproduction late in life. So it's really only seen in birds that have some kind of release from typical ecological mortality, like being killed by predators. They have a pretty good chance of dying of old age, basically. Now, a good example of that and how it's associated with the immune system and this idea of trade-offs between current reproduction and future reproduction. If you're an older blue-footed booby and you're actually kind of sickly, well, in that situation, you better just put all your cards in, right? Because your chances of surviving to the next year are pretty low. And so it doesn't really matter if you overextend yourself. If you're a pretty good chance you're going to die anyway, they may actually increase their reproductive effort in later in life because of just the low probability of making it into the next year. All right, well, that is the end of this lecture. In the next lecture, we're going to pick up looking at feathers and then moving into talking about flight.